After nearly a decade of using Lightroom to edit my photos, I've learned some tips and techniques that changed my photo editing for the better. Today, I'm sharing 10 years of experience in a video with editing secrets that I wish I knew earlier. Things like why raising blacks over shadows can make your photos look a lot more pleasing and natural, the right way to use the tone curve and basic adjustment, or how to use some hidden tools that make your workflow more streamlined and more efficient. So whether you're new with Lightroom or looking to refine your style, this video should help, and let's start with the first tip. When editing your photos, you have probably lifted the shadows to bring out details and lowered the black to bring back the contrast. This is something I have been told early in my editing journey, and it stuck with me for way too long. Last year, I finally challenged this idea and tried raising blacks over shadows. It transformed my editing style, helping me achieve a more natural, almost film-like aesthetic. First, we'll quickly define what the two sliders do. The black slider adjusts the darker tones in your image. Raising black levels make these deep tones less intense and recovers the information, unlike raising the black point in the tone curve where you just create a fade and lose all the details. What I found is that raising the black slider opens up the darker tones and moves the whole histogram to the right, resulting in a brighter and softer image. The shadow slider is a lot more precise and targets the shadows and darker midtones. By moving the shadows to the right, you can recover details in the darker areas, but the whole histogram doesn't move smoothly alongside it. Because of that, raising shadows excessively can really create an HDR look, as only a small part of the tonal range is affected. There are many benefits to raising blacks over shadows. For example, it does a better job at preserving a natural looking contrast, just like photos taken on film. Lifting shadows, on the other hand, flattens your image, reduces the contrast and make it look artificial or over-processed. Raising black levels soften the darker areas without losing depth and structure. The result is subtle and more pleasing to the eye. It also keeps a very natural looking highlight and mid-tone separation. This separation adds depth and dimension to your photo, making it feel more professional and intentional. Raising the shadow slider too much would lead to shadows and midtones being blended, losing contrast and creating this artificial HDR look. Raising blacks, interestingly, does a better job at maintaining image quality. It is often in the shadows that you can find some noise or artifacts, especially in low light, higher ISO images. Raising shadows would reveal too much of these dirtier areas, resulting in a less clean image. For the sake of this demonstration, I will raise the blacks to 100 on one copy of this image and raise the shadows to 100 on another one. We can see how the version with the black slider raised looks more natural. On the shadow slider version, the adjustment was a lot more targeted and looks very unrealistic. Now if we try this new approach, raising blacks more than shadows, and compare it to the result of raising shadows and pulling blacks like I used to do, we can see that the result is a lot more pleasing and organic, if I may say. The best way to do it is to trust your eye and move the slider up until you find a sweet spot. Alternatively, you can use a more mathematical approach by holding the Option key while moving the slider up until it reaches a point where there is no more black spot and you can see almost a fully white frame. But this technique works only if you haven't raised your black point in the tone curve previously. I think that Option 1 is better, but using this second way can help you for the first dozens of pictures you will edit using this approach. The second tip I have is a good follow-up on the previous one, and I'd say that it is more than a tip because it's a whole editing philosophy which happens to be the correct one, according to me, and more importantly, according to Adobe. The basic adjustments are here to help you recover information in your files and not create the style. These adjustments are primarily intended to correct exposure, contrast to some degree, and color balance, thereby recovering information. The stylistic aspect of your final look, like contrast, color adjustment, color grading, and presence, should be adjusted using the other tools. The tone curve is here to create the contrast. You really have to think of the basic adjustments being your first layer and the tone curve a second layer on top of it to play with the luminance of each tonal area to create contrast. We can see a proof of that by looking at the two histograms, the general histogram and the embedded one in the tone curve. When you adjust something in the basic adjustments, you see that both histograms move, but when you adjust the tone curve, only the general histogram moves. This means that what you will do in the tone curve will come on top and work on the base of information created by the basic adjustments. When I finally understood that, it really streamlined my editing process and also the way I create my presets or copy the same edits to a bunch of photos. Now, I always leave the basic adjustments untouched and adjust them on a photo per photo basis. All the style is already there in the presets and the only thing left to do is pushing or pulling information to make the photo work. But of course, if the style itself doesn't fit, some adjustment will be made on the tone curve or other tools to fit the photo. The third tip has to do with colors, and now I almost always prioritize vibrance to boost the colors on my images. Sometimes I use a mix of both vibrance and saturation, but before getting into the details, let's understand their differences and how they affect your photos. Saturation adjusts the intensity of all colors equally across the image. It has a strong effect, so it can quickly make an image appear too saturated and unnatural. Extra caution is needed on photos with people, as the skin tones are very sensitive to high saturation, making everyone look like Oompa Loompas. Vibrance is a much smarter tool. It adjusts the intensity of less saturated colors while protecting already saturated tones. It is also a lot more gentle to the skin tones, making it ideal for portraits or images with people. Overall, it's a more subtle tool and can often create a more natural looking enhancement compared to saturation. In most cases, vibrance will be the best tool to use to boost the colors of your images. People, landscape, street, almost any photography genre will benefit from using vibrance in priority versus saturation. Saturation can do the job and can be used alone on pictures without people in them, but I almost always find the results with vibrance looking better. Saturation can be here to support the heavy lifting done by the vibrance slider. If you already push vibrance a lot, you can add a touch of saturation from +5 to +15 to give your image that final little boost in a heavenly way, because as we saw before, saturation affects all colors. Now, if we have a look into my workflow when I edit photos using my presets, which you can find in the description by the way, first I apply the preset, and usually it comes with some pre-existing HSL adjustments that are carefully crafted to achieve a specific look. Next, I evaluate whether the colors need further tweaking. If I want to boost the colors, vibrance is the best way to subtly enhance the colors that the preset didn't fully bring out. Being a more gentle tool, I don't hesitate to bring it up to high values like +50 and above to see how it works and park it somewhere I like. At this point, if the image still feels too flat or lacks impact, I carefully adjust the saturation slider. Vibrance and saturation tweaks often complement presets without needing to dive into detailed HSL edits, but if any specific colors looks off, I can always dig deeper into the HSL or even the color point tool to make very precise adjustments. When I edit from scratch, the same applies, and I suggest boosting the colors, giving the priority to vibrance and using saturation for a final kick. I also recommend spending some time on the HSL tab and then coming back to the vibrance and saturation sliders after that. The truth is that most of the time I boost slightly the vibrance to start with a more colorful base, then tweak the HSL and finally come back to vibrance and saturation for final adjustments. After talking about more substantial techniques, now let's cover more straightforward tips and shortcuts that changed my life when editing in Lightroom. When using the brush tool, you can click somewhere in the photo, then hold Shift and click somewhere else in the photo, and you will have a nice straight line linking the 2 points. What I like even more is clicking once somewhere, then changing the size of my brush and repeating the same, Shift and click. That's the best way I found to create perfectly shaped cone masks, useful when you want to accentuate a source of light that has this more triangular shape. Then, with the linear mask, when you hold Shift while dragging it, it will stay perfectly parallel to the edge of the frame you are pulling the mask from. This is very useful when you want to darken, for example, the buildings on both sides of the street, or the foreground, or affect the sky in a very gradual way when intersected with an automatic sky select mask. Holding Shift when creating a radial mask also works and helps you achieve a perfectly rounded mask. By the way, when you use the erase tool, just like I said before about the brush tool, you can click once, hold Shift and click a second time to create a straight line. The cone shape tip also works, but I see less of a use case for it with the eraser tool, but use it if you like. Like we saw before when talking about the black slider, the option key is here to help you in a lot of different ways across all the tools in Lightroom. It helps you checking clipping blacks and whites. In the tone curve, it helps you better control your adjustments by making it slower to move the point around. It requires more motion with your mouse or trackpad to move the point, letting you make finer adjustments. On the topic of tone curve, if you hold Shift and not Option, you will be able to move your point only up and down instead of in all directions. This is another tip to help you better control your tone curve adjustments. In the HSL tool, when you're holding the Option key and moving any of the colors, all the other colors will be desaturated, so you can better understand where on your image the adjustment applies. It works in any of the hue, saturation and luminance sections. In the color grading tab, it is similar to the tone curve. Holding the Option key will make more gentle adjustments, and holding Shift will set the hue and let you move only the saturation value. And last but not least, in the Detail tab you can hold Option and adjust the mask slider to reveal the part of your image that will be affected by the sharpening adjustments. Everything you see in white will be affected and sharpened. I am sure you have had the same dilemma. You're almost done editing a photo, but you feel like it lacks a little bit of punch. But you don't really know what to adjust to give it that final kick. Maybe the whites, the tone curve, maybe both. I've been there, and to be honest, now with 10 years of experience I actually know where to adjust, but sometimes I'm just lazy to dive again in the tone curve to find where to push to obtain what I want. So what I do instead happens in the color grading tab. For a long time I only used this tool to do what it suggests, color grade my photo, but you can also affect the brightness of each individual tone with it, so I often find myself relying on that to give my photos that final punch. For that, I try lifting the luminance in the midtones and the highlights. Sometimes it's a combination of both. Giving a nice push in the midtones can work well on portraits, since the skin tones usually lie in the midtones. Like we discussed before, this tool also comes after the basic adjustments, so you won't affect the information of the raw files, but affect the luminance of the tones just like the tone curve would do. Last, you can also create a fade by lifting the luminance of the shadows. If you don't want to redesign your tone curve but want some fade, you can do it in the color grading tab. If you want to go the other route and give your highlights more of a matte finish, there are a few things that you can do. First, and the thing that I do in most of my photos, is bringing down the clarity down in the negatives. It will soften the overlook of the highlights, giving them a more diffuse matte appearance. Reducing texture too can help, but be careful not to overdo it and lose all the sharpness and micro contrast. Next, in the tone curve you will be able to really control your white point. Bringing it down will help reach these more matte, film-looking highlights. You can increase that effect by also using the parametric curve. I like narrowing that highlight section and then bringing it down a significant amount to reach this matte look. Alternatively, you could go to the color grading tab, like we said before, and bring down the highlight luminance. But what I like less with this solution is that you have less control over how big the highlight area is. The last step to help mattify your highlights is adding gray. While it does not directly affect the highlights, it complements the matte aesthetic by adding texture and character to the image. And the last quick tip to wrap up this video, I am a user of Lightroom Classic. I have always been and probably will always be. But for the ones who prefer Lightroom normal, I mean the one without the classic at the end, you might have noticed that the color calibration tool is not there. That is only because of the default settings. The color calibration tool actually exists in Lightroom. You simply have to select the photo you wish to edit, click on the edit icon located on the right hand side. Now locate and click on the three dots situated at the bottom right corner, and finally can click on show color calibration. Now you can access this powerful tool to further dig into color management, also in Lightroom if you're allergic to Lightroom Classic. Okay, I think that's it. I hope you find any of these tips or techniques helpful. I'm looking forward to reading your comments and see you next time. Bye.